Before we begin, a quick note so we're on the same page. Everything I'm about to share is educational, respectful, and intended for consenting adults. We're going to talk about sexual fantasies in a medically grounded, psychologically informed, and judgment-free way. If any part of this topic feels uncomfortable, that's normal. You can pause, breathe, and come back whenever you're ready. I'm Dr. Catherin Harris, and today we're going to bring light to a subject that far too often lives in the shadows: sexual fantasies, what's normal, what isn't, and how to relate to your inner world with clarity, compassion, and responsibility. Let me start with a question. When you hear the phrase sexual fantasy, what emotion shows up first? Curiosity, excitement, embarrassment, anxiety, or a little of everything? Many people assume that if a fantasy surprises them or doesn't match their values perfectly, it must be a sign that something is wrong. In reality, fantasies are one of the most common, natural expressions of a healthy imagination. The brain uses fantasy to explore possibilities, to rehearse scenarios, to process feelings, and to spark desire. Having a fantasy doesn't obligate you to do anything in the real world. It doesn't define your worth, your character, or your destiny. It simply reflects how your mind plays with ideas and sensations, sometimes deeply meaningful, sometimes purely imaginative. Here's the foundation I want you to hold throughout this episode. In adults, a sexual fantasy is normal when it remains within the boundaries of consent, safety, and mutual respect in real life, when it doesn't cause harm to you or others, and when it does not take over your functioning, your relationships, or your sense of self. A fantasy can be unusual and still be okay. It can be common and still feel complicated. What matters is not whether a fantasy appears on a list of the top 10 most common themes, but whether you can relate to it with self-awareness, agency, and integrity. Now, why do fantasies exist in the first place? From a medical and psychological perspective, fantasies help regulate arousal, reduce stress, and integrate emotions. They can give language to needs that are difficult to say out loud, like the need to feel wanted, admired, safe, powerful, surrendered, playful, or free. They can also be a mental rehearsal for intimacy, offering a guilt-free space to imagine, to test boundaries in your mind, and to understand what resonates. The content of a fantasy: who's there, where it takes place, who initiates, who leads, often points to an underlying emotional storyline. Sometimes the storyline is as simple as, "I want to feel special." Other times it's, "I want to feel safe enough to let go," or "I want to be in control because life feels chaotic," or "I want to be desired without having to perform." If you listen closely, the emotional subtext becomes clearer than the surface details. Let's address one of the biggest fears. If I fantasize about something, does it mean I secretly want to do it? Not necessarily. In many cases, the mind plays with contrasts and symbols rather than literal instructions. For example, a fantasy about being strongly desired may symbolize the wish to stop over-functioning and finally be the one who is pursued. A fantasy about leading and being in charge may symbolize the desire to stop feeling helpless and to reclaim agency. The images can look intense, but the emotional need driving them is often tender, human, and very understandable. This is why approaching your inner world with curiosity rather than condemnation is so important. Curiosity lets you ask, what feeling does this fantasy promise me? Safety, power, connection, relief? Once you know the feeling, you can look for healthier, real-world ways to meet that need with a consenting partner or within yourself. So, what's normal? Statistically, many adults report having fantasies about being desired, being in control, letting go of control, novel places, role play, or simply amplifying closeness and attention. Some fantasize more than others. Some need fantasy to get aroused, others rarely use it. Frequency varies widely. Some people fantasize daily, some only occasionally. All of this can fit within the spectrum of healthy sexuality, as long as your fantasies remain invitations, not obligations, tools, not tyrants. If a fantasy adds vitality and playfulness to your relationship without breaching anyone's boundaries, it's likely fine. If it begins to isolate you, make you secretive, or replaces real intimacy with compulsive escape, it deserves attention. Now let's look at a different question. What isn't normal? Or more precisely, what deserves a red flag and professional support? First, any fantasy that involves minors, absence of consent, or harm is not appropriate for enactment ever. Even imagining such themes can be disturbing. If those thoughts are intrusive or distressing, please seek a qualified mental health professional. Second, if fantasies become obsessive, if they drive behavior that violates your values or your partner's boundaries, or if you feel unable to function without them, that's a sign to slow down and get help. Third, if a fantasy relies on secrecy that would betray an agreement in your relationship, the problem is not the content of the fantasy, but the lack of integrity around it. Finally, if you're using fantasy primarily to avoid emotional pain, numbing out, escaping chronic loneliness, or soothing stress in a way that creates more problems than it solves, then we need to support you in expanding your toolbox for dealing with life. You might be wondering, what if my fantasy scares me? Sometimes a fantasy shocks us because it clashes with our identity or cultural messaging. You might think, that's not me, and yet the fantasy shows up. Instead of pushing it away with shame, try this gentle inquiry. What is the craving underneath this image? Is it about being fully seen and chosen? Is it about letting go of responsibility for a moment? Is it about adventure and novelty because routine has dulled your senses? When you decode the emotional meaning, you give yourself options. You might discover, for example, that the real desire is for deeper presence from your partner, or for negotiations around who initiates, or for a safe container where you can drop perfectionism and just be. The moment you understand the need, you can talk about it without using charged labels or triggering defenses. Let's talk about values, consent, and the bridge between imagination and reality. A healthy adult relationship requires 4 pillars: clear consent, mutual respect, emotional safety, and accountability. Consent means each person freely agrees, can revoke that agreement at any time, and has the power to say no without repercussion. Mutual respect means neither person treats the other as a prop or object. Emotional safety means there's space for both desire and hesitation. You can explore, pause, and renegotiate. Accountability means you keep your word and you repair when you make a mistake. If a fantasy cannot cross that bridge, if it demands secrecy, humiliation, or breaches of trust, it stays in the realm of imagination. Plenty of fantasies are best left as mental stories. That doesn't make you broken, it makes you wise. Alongside consent and safety, there's the question of how to talk about fantasies with a partner. Here's a simple framework that I teach in clinic. First, check your intention. Are you sharing to increase intimacy or to pressure your partner? If it's the latter, pause. Second, pick the right moment, when you're both calm, not in the heat of the moment. Third, use I language and stay with feelings and meanings rather than graphic details. For example, I think about scenarios where I feel intensely wanted. It makes me feel cherished and alive. I don't need to act it out literally, but I'd love to find ways with you to feel more desired. Fourth, invite your partner's boundaries. What parts of that sound okay to you? What doesn't? Fifth, create experiments that are low stakes, fully consensual, and easy to stop. You might agree on a code word that means pause, or a hand squeeze that means slow down. Sixth, check in afterward. What worked, what didn't, and what did you learn about each other? The goal is not to recreate a movie scene, it's to translate the emotional essence of the fantasy into a shared caring experience. Now let's zoom in on a few common patterns and how to navigate them. Some people worry that needing novelty means something is wrong with their relationship. Novelty is a basic ingredient of arousal because the brain releases more attention and reward when something feels new. That doesn't mean you need to keep escalating. It means you can vary the setting, the pace, the script, the roles of who initiates, the way you communicate desire, the music, the lighting, the length of time, the affectionate rituals before and after. Small changes can restore freshness without abandoning safety. Another common worry is a mismatch in fantasy frequency. One partner may have a rich inner movie theater. The other may be more present-focused and sensual without a strong imagination. Neither is better. The key is respect. If you're highly imaginative, share the themes, not a rigid storyboard. If you're less imaginative, don't shame your partner for their inner world. You can participate by asking for the emotional ingredients that feel good to you, maybe more verbal appreciation, slower buildup, or more reassurance. The art is in finding overlap while honoring differences. Let's address intrusive fantasies, thoughts or images that pop up uninvited and feel out of character. Intrusive thoughts are common in anxiety and stress. The more you try to suppress them, the louder they can become. The antidote is mindful noticing without fusion. You can say to yourself, "There's that thought again," and gently return to the present. Over time, you can ask, "What was I feeling just before that image popped in? Tired, pressured, bored, lonely?" Meeting the underlying state, rest, connection, novelty in healthy ways, usually quiets the noise. If intrusive fantasies are persistent, disturbing, or linked to past trauma, please seek professional support. Therapy can help separate old fear networks from present-day intimacy, so you can feel safer in your body. Now, a word about shame. Shame is an inhibitor of intimacy. It tightens the body, disrupts arousal, and pushes us into hiding. When you carry shame about your fantasies, you often create the very conditions that make closeness harder: silence, secrecy, tension. The cure for shame is earned safety, gentle truth-telling, and compassion. Start with yourself. Write down the fantasy in very simple terms without graphic detail. Then ask, what's the heart need underneath it? Circle the need: safety, admiration, play, rest, agency, surrender, validation. Next, ask, how could I meet that need ethically? What conversation could I have? What boundary do I need to state? What ritual of affection would touch that need? This reframes fantasy from a threat to a compass. Let's also talk about cultural scripts. Many of us learn narrow stories about desire, that good people don't fantasize, that wanting to feel powerful is bad, that wanting to let go is weak, that wanting attention is shallow. These scripts are too small for the complexity of human desire. In healthy adult contexts, wanting to feel powerful can mean reclaiming agency in a world that often takes it away. Wanting to let go can mean healing from over-responsibility and finally resting. Wanting attention can mean the nervous system craving the safety that comes from being seen. When we de-shame the meanings, we discover new ways to honor them without breaking trust. Let me offer a practical exercise I give couples who want to explore fantasies safely. Each person takes a sheet of paper and draws 3 concentric circles. In the innermost circle, write yes. Ideas you feel comfortable exploring or translating into emotional ingredients right now. In the middle circle, write maybe. Themes you're curious about but would need more conversation, slower pacing, or a specific boundary to feel safe. In the outer circle, write no. Themes that are off limits for you. Start with your yes. Compare your circles and look for overlap. Your yes today might have been a maybe last year, and vice versa. Circles can change with life stages, stress, health, hormones, or relationship context. The exercise respects both discovery and safety. It's not a negotiation to push boundaries, it's a map to honor them. Some of you might ask, what about fantasies that involve power dynamics? In adult consensual relationships, dynamics of leading and following can be explored ethically when there is clear consent aftercare, and ongoing communication. The focus needs to be on the emotional truth beneath the imagery: trust, surrender, responsibility, containment, care. If you can't guarantee those conditions, you do not have the foundation to explore those dynamics safely. Remember, your partner is never a prop for your fantasy, and you are never a prop for theirs. You are two whole people co-creating an experience with care. Now let's consider health factors that can shape fantasies. Hormonal shifts, medications, mood, sleep, stress, pain, and medical conditions can all influence desire and the stories your brain reaches for. If you're in perimenopause or menopause, if you're postpartum, if you're managing depression or anxiety, if you're taking selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or other medications, your arousal patterns and fantasy frequency may change. This is not a moral problem. It's biology and psychology doing what they do. Speak with your clinician about any concerns, especially if changes are distressing or affect your quality of life. Sometimes small adjustments, improving sleep, addressing pain, treating dryness, scheduling protected time for connection, can restore your capacity to imagine and enjoy. Because this is a judgment-free space, I also want to address religious or moral values. Many people hold sacred beliefs about sexuality, and they worry that having fantasies means they're failing spiritually. Here's a compassionate reframe. Thoughts arise. What defines you is how you choose to live. If a fantasy conflicts with your values, you can still treat yourself kindly while making choices that align with your conscience. You can say, "That thought doesn't fit who I want to be," and gently return to practices that anchor you. Gratitude, prayer, meditation, service, loving presence with your partner. Integrating values and desire is not about perfect thoughts. It's about honest living. Another important topic is secrecy versus privacy. Every individual and every couple needs privacy, the sacred space where intimacy flourishes without external judgment. Privacy is healthy. Secrecy, however, is different. Secrecy is the intentional concealment of something that would violate your partner's trust or shared agreements. If a fantasy requires secrecy, examine why. Is there shame that needs compassion? Is there an unmet need you're afraid to voice? Is there a boundary you fear will be rejected? The solution is not to bury yourself deeper. It's to move toward integrity, even if that means difficult conversations or, in some cases, individual therapy to sort your inner world before bringing it to your partner. What about people who don't fantasize at all? That can be perfectly normal. Some individuals experience desire more through the senses, touch, smell, warmth, breath, than through imagery or narrative. Others are demisexual or asexual and experience desire differently. Healthy sexuality is diverse. If you don't fantasize and you're content, there's nothing to fix. If you want to cultivate a more vivid inner world, gentle practices like reading romantic literature that centers emotional connection, practicing mindfulness to heighten body awareness, or spending more time in affectionate, non-goal-oriented closeness can nudge the imagination awake without forcing anything. If you're single, how do fantasies fit into your dating life? They can guide you toward compatibility. Notice the themes that make you feel most alive: warmth, playfulness, emotional intensity, steadiness, humor. And look for those qualities in potential partners rather than chasing a specific script. Share at a pace that matches trust. Early disclosure of highly charged fantasies can overwhelm both people. Lead with values, respect, and curiosity. As trust grows, the conversation can deepen. If dating apps or online content have shaped your fantasies in ways that feel unsatisfying or unrealistic, consider a gentle detox to recalibrate your nervous system towards slower, more present connection. Let's turn to the difference between fantasy and compulsion. A fantasy is a story you can pick up and put down. Compulsion is a loop you feel trapped in. The signposts of compulsion include preoccupation, escalating intensity, lying, neglecting responsibilities, and feeling empty or ashamed afterward. If you notice these patterns, treat it like any health concern, with seriousness and compassion. You're not bad, you're overwhelmed. Support can include therapy, support groups, medical evaluation, and practical guardrails like reducing triggering content, improving sleep, exercising, and reconnecting with real-world sources of meaning. Because we're talking about meaning, I want to invite you to reflect on the stories you inherited about what kind of desire you're allowed to have. Who taught you those stories? Did you learn that good intimacy is always spontaneous, that wanting guidance makes you needy, that asking for reassurance is unromantic, that initiating is only for one gender? Many fantasies arise to correct these rigid scripts. Your inner world might be asking for reciprocity if you've been the only initiator. It might be asking for tenderness if you've been praised only for performance. It might be asking for sovereignty if you've been expected to be endlessly accommodating. When you listen to these requests with compassion, you expand the relationship beyond old roles. Now I want to give you language you can use, because practical scripts make hard conversations easier. If you want to bring up fantasies without alarming your partner, you could say, "I'd like to talk about our inner worlds around desire." Not to push for anything, just to understand each other better and feel closer. Would now be a good time? Ask for permission to enter the conversation. Then, I notice that my mind sometimes plays with scenarios where I feel very wanted and pursued. I think the heart of it is that I want to feel chosen without having to perform. I don't need to act anything out. Could we brainstorm small ways to build that feeling together? If you're the listener, you could respond, "Thank you for trusting me with that. I want you to feel safe and cherished. Here are the parts that feel okay to me, and here are the parts I'm not comfortable with." Keep it collaborative. End with appreciation. "That was vulnerable. Thank you for staying with me." If you and your partner have different appetites for risk and novelty, try pacing. One person sets a slower tempo, the other sets a playful tone. You can choose a single small experiment and debrief afterward. Rather than fixating on a scene, focus on sensations and emotions: warmth, reassurance, the sound of your partner's voice, the feeling of being admired. Most fantasies can be translated into these universal ingredients without reproducing the exact imagery. Let's also honor boundaries as acts of love. Saying no is a gift, because it makes every yes meaningful. If your partner shares a fantasy and your body says no, you can respond with kindness and clarity. "I'm grateful you told me. I want us both to feel safe. I'm not comfortable with that theme, but I am open to exploring the feeling behind it. Can we find a way to create that feeling that fits my boundaries?" This keeps the connection alive without self-betrayal. A final area I want to cover is healing past experiences. If you've been hurt in the past, your nervous system might latch onto fantasies that promise control or protection. You might gravitate towards scenes where you're invulnerable or where everything is pre-planned. There's nothing wrong with wanting safety. Healing means gradually expanding your window of tolerance with trustworthy partners, practicing consent as a living dialogue, and learning that you can pause, renegotiate, or stop at any moment. Over time, the imagination becomes less about defense and more about play. As we wrap up, let me leave you with this perspective. Fantasies are part of your psychological ecosystem. They carry information about your needs, your stresses, your longings, and your creativity. They are not moral verdicts. Measured against the compass of consent, safety, honesty, and care, most adult fantasies can be acknowledged with curiosity, and when appropriate, gently woven into shared intimacy in ways that honor everyone's dignity. When a fantasy conflicts with those pillars, you can let it remain in the private theater of the mind, appreciated as a dream rather than a directive. And when a fantasy becomes intrusive, compulsive, or distressing, you deserve support and you're not alone. If you found this helpful, here's a simple reflection you can do tonight. Write one sentence about a theme that sometimes appears in your mind, then answer, "What feeling does it promise me?" Choose one small, ethical way to meet that feeling in your real life. Ask your partner for a kind word, schedule unrushed affection, set a boundary that protects your energy, or plan time for playful connection without goals. Desire thrives where safety and truth meet. And remember, you don't have to solve your inner world in one conversation. You just have to start treating it with respect. I'm Dr. Catherin Harris. Thank you for trusting me with this conversation. Take care of your body, your heart, and your integrity. When you do, your imagination becomes an ally. Not a judge, not a jailer, but a creative force that helps you build a more connected, compassionate life.